I'll get one. I'll get one.
Just to start, we wanted to get a sense of the composition of where you guys are from. Are we talking agency people, client side?
How many of you are working in corporate marketing or advertising on the client side? And agencies, do we have any agencies? And how many people are currently actively engaged in reaching out to the Hispanic segment in the U.S.? So pretty sophisticated bunch. Do you consider yourselves to be pretty sophisticated direct marketers when it comes to the Hispanic segment? And yes, no. Well, this is an intermediate session, so we're gonna try and keep it on par with the level you're at. And I think we have an intimate enough group that we should be able to create some good discussion, be able to ask some questions, ask and answer some questions, and hopefully meet your expectations. This is really the first time I think we focused on a Hispanic topic at the General Assembly outside of the Spanish language tract that the DMA conducts. So we're excited to be asked here. Elizabeth and I are both with Diestel, so we're agency people, and we brought our client, Shelly Riera, with us from AT&T because we are going to talk specifically about how we're addressing the segment through AT&T case studies. So I guess, Elizabeth, I'll turn it over to you. And really the promise of this session was that we were going to look at when you go from a branding platform. Brand is your brand, and it represents who you are as a company and what you stand for. But when you take that down into direct tactics, where you're really trying to figure out what the drivers of behavior are to create a response, how do you stay true to your brand, but yet craft that message, understand what drives that consumer in a general market, in a Hispanic execution, so that you get the best response possible. And in order to get to that, and we are going to share some creative, some DRTV, some direct mail, where you can see apples to apples comparisons. We're talking about the same thing from the same brand voice, the same brand.
Working on developing our kind of creative strategy and our platform. I'm going to just take you guys back a couple of steps and talk to you about our methodology and our thinking, and also just talk about some really important characteristics and developments in the Hispanic market that really help frame the way we think about being as relevant as possible to this segment. This kind of three categories is the way that we look at developing this strategy. We talk about personal identity and explore that to sort of understand, how do I understand and express myself, what are the elements involved there, the community or market experience, and I'll get into this more detail later, and then the cultural context, which is particularly important for this segment. And then really the theme of our development, whether it comes to research or the question we ask as we develop a strategy and a focus for our programs, and as we develop creative, how does this really matter to people? I think that all of us working in direct marketing, we talk a lot about consumers and targets. And obviously that's a key element in how we define our marketing strategies. But I think that the role of research and what's so rich and interesting about working in an area like the Hispanic segment is that it's required of us to really understand this cultural human context for our products, for our services, for our messages. So that's kind of what I'm going to address in this section. I'm just going to go through 6 really important developments that I think affect the socioeconomic, demographic, and cultural experience of Hispanics in the U.S. The rise of Generation X. This is the first time, really kind of right now, this is happening, that the growth of the Hispanic market of U.S.-born Hispanics is actually outpacing that of immigrants. And it's actually being exacerbated right now by the economic situation, because we are seeing immigration slow. And we actually are seeing some immigrants returning to Latin America, whether it's Mexico or Central America, because of the certain jobs are really being affected by what's going on in certain regions as well. But even beyond what's happening in the economic situation, there is this growth of this second generation Hispanic, and what's happening is that's changing and evolving the characteristics of the population. So we're starting to see, number one, a very young population, number two, a lot of these kind of divides and gaps that people historically associate with the Hispanic market, saying, well, this market is less educated, this market is maybe not as sophisticated about technology, not as sophisticated about financial services. We're starting to see all of those gaps close when you see this younger generation, a U.S.-born generation, really engaging in a very sophisticated way in all those categories. So this is a really important thing to keep in mind. It also helps us understand really who are we talking to when we're talking to the Hispanic market. And it needs to be a decision on the part of you as marketers to say, I'm going to speak to a Spanish-dominant immigrant. That does not define the Hispanic market. Actually, the Hispanic market, by and large, is bicultural, more bicultural, bilingual, and split between immigrants and U.S.-born Hispanics. So it's a lot more complicated in that sense, or nuanced, than I think historically we, as marketers, have treated the market. I mentioned earlier that because of this driver of Generation Mas, the urban youth, this multicultural, diverse urban youth, is really a place that's really interesting. At AT&T, working with AT&T, we have the pleasure and privilege of collaborating with our sister or partner agencies, African American and Asian. And there are times when all of our segments intersect when we're talking about the youth target. And more we see this really as a demographic and cultural trend, so that this kind of urban multicultural youth, they're taste makers, taste setters, that it's not segments or living in silos. It's really this kind of collaborative, multicultural experience, and that is located or focused in key urban areas where you see a strong mix of all of these, of the African American, Asian, and Hispanic segments. And so that depending on what you're marketing, what you're focusing on, it's a really interesting opportunity. It's an interesting way to think about what does my brand mean to this segment, to this group, and again challenges some of the more rigid or limited ways of thinking about the Hispanic market, because you can't assume that when you're talking to this youth group that you're just going to be talking to people that identify themselves exclusively as Hispanics and only hang out with Hispanics or speak Spanish and that kind of thing. This is really focusing on demographic trends right now that we see are really interesting. Is again, and probably you guys have experience in this when you're thinking about where do I reach this market and what is that market like. Historically, we've seen Miami, New York, Chicago, LA, and then some markets like in Texas, Houston, as the key Hispanic markets. And you do see that the majority of the Hispanic population are still located in those markets, but you see these very strong trends of triple-digit population growth in the Southeast, in the Midwest, in the Northwest. And I was at a conference, and the head of Hispanic marketing at Best Buy was telling an anecdotal story that he's from this little town outside of Minneapolis, and he said his little town, which was just this kind of typical Midwestern town when he was growing up, is now over 50% Hispanic, because that demographic trend has just completely changed the face of what's happening there. So he realized that's really what snapped him into this, working at Best Buy. He realized, you know what, we really have to pay attention to this, not just as a marketer who's focusing on these big urban areas, but all over the place. We're also seeing the Latinization of suburbs. You probably see it here very much in Las Vegas, Phoenix, Arizona, where you see actually people moving from urban areas to suburbs, or in states where housing is more affordable, where education seems to be better. So that also changes the experience of the people that we're talking to, the urban versus the suburban experience. And then we also see in some urban areas, particularly in Chicago and New York, in the Northeast more, is the Hispanic population moving into urban areas that have been kind of maybe not so much residential, but now the property prices have dropped, and there's this cultural desire to live in a collective way in a historic neighborhood, and there's kind of an ownership of these people coming in and saying, cool, this is an interesting place, there's some history here, let's move back in. So it's sort of a re-urbanization. And as I mentioned before, that this rise of Generation Mas, but also in addition, just in general, the access to technology and education is really changing the Hispanic market. It's bicultural. That doesn't always mean bilingual, but you do definitely see a lot more bilingualism. There's a pan-Latino unity. I think a lot of the political situations going on, one of the most interesting examples was the immigration marches that you see across the entire country over last year galvanized this sense of Latino-ness in the U.S., which was kind of has broken down some of that sense of Cuban, Puerto Rican, Mexican. Not to say that there's not cultural nuances there, but there is also a sense of being a Hispanic in the U.S. and what that means. And also, you guys have probably heard the term sometimes about retroculturation, which also contributes to this sense about bilingualism or biculturalism. I'm from Texas, and if you go back one generation in Texas, in parts of Texas it was actually illegal to speak Spanish in public. So you have the kids of that generation that don't speak Spanish. But now, because of this changing role of the Latino in the U.S., they're saying, no, I want to speak Spanish. I want to learn about my culture. I want to be able to talk to my grandparents in their language. And so you see this desire to actively participate in the culture in a different way than we've seen before. Latina power. This is, it's in parallel with the evolving role of women in the workplace, with women in politics, with women in culture. You see this as well with the Latinas, and I do think it's important to point out that there are, of course, cultural nuances and important elements about what being a Latina is about, and distinctions about what that role is like. But I think there's also, it's very easy to fall into stereotypes here. You've probably seen it if you watch Spanish language television and you've watched those commercials and seen certain ways of targeting the Hispanic woman, which is, in my research, I've heard them saying, so tired of being talked to, like, I want to just spend all my time in the kitchen waiting for my husband to get home, because that's not true. And the role of the Latina as this sort of evolving, his culture is evolving, is really strong and important to pay attention to. So you see these kind of trends of the power mama, so working women. There are more small businesses started by Latinas than any other group in the U.S. Working women, single mothers, and it's really interesting to see that this idea of the Latina voz is really about Latinas using technology to come together and collaborate and talk to each other about things and kind of unify and strengthen their voice, because it's a clear sense of making progress and sharing that progress and wanting that progress to continue happening. So that's a powerful emotional place to be able to tap into and pay attention to as you're thinking about this segment. And then, of course, this is our special point of passion, working on AT&T, but technology is a catalyst. And this is a really interesting place because there's a lot of stereotypes here as well that we're really seeing that they start to break down, is that this Latino cultural characteristic of really valuing kind of above and beyond all else this cultural sense of socializing, being together, of a collective lifestyle, which means I always want to be able to pick up my phone and talk to whomever I feel like talking to right at that spontaneous moment. That being online is about being connected and being spontaneous and sharing and being cultural. More than being managing my time and being productive, that's the highest order of value. So what that actually does is kind of pushes the Hispanic population, leapfrogs them a little bit over the general population in more sophisticated technology practices. And so in direct sort of contradiction to maybe some stereotypes you have, there's this linear process that immigrants would go through to get accustomed to using technology. It's actually quite the opposite of that you see. A lot of, and regardless of income or even years in the U.S., you'll see over-indexing in social networking and using data-enabled mobile devices and texting and downloading ringtones and taking videos and watching videos on their mobile devices. So all of this stuff, it's because it's valuable. It fits in with that culture, what you want to do. And so when technology supports that, when it shows up as being part of that, it's extremely appealing, and you'll see very sophisticated practices. So we continue to see that. So those are just the kind of things that are happening right now in the market and the U.S. Hispanic experience. I think it's important, no matter what you're doing or what you're focusing on or what kinds of tactics you're using, keep that in the context and kind of your range as you assess and build your strategy. More specifically, when I showed you those three circles in the beginning and talked about personal identity, this is, we want to address the acculturation issue, because I'm sure everyone, again, if you're marketing to the Hispanic population, you are talking about acculturation. And for years, we've used this kind of, as an industry, we've used a kind of traditional linear model of acculturation. I say it's the train analogy of that. I get on at stop A, and the train goes, and as the train, if I get off at stop B, I'm acculturated, and if I get off at stop C, I'm assimilated. So it's this kind of linear process that happens over time. And it's not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because of course there are elements of truth in this, and there are ways that this is applicable, and it's particularly useful when you're thinking, I think historically it's almost been kind of defined and used most by media, is that you say, okay, for a less acculturated Hispanic, we're going to do Spanish language media, and that's works. For an assimilated Hispanic, then the general market catches them in that net. We as an agency, and I think in general just as an industry, are all starting to focus on a more meaningful, nuanced understanding about how this really happens and what it's like. And I think, talking in earlier when I was talking about these different situations, suburban versus urban versus rural, being in a small town when 10 years ago there were no Hispanics in that town versus being in LA, having access to culture, all of these things go into and contribute to the experience that you have as a Latino, and the way that you understand yourself and understand your community and culture. So we're looking at country of origin, you're looking at the role of language and media, but you're also looking at education, the city that you reside, number of years in the U.S., and of course your economic status. So all of these elements, it's a more nuanced understanding, it's a richer picture, there's more to pay attention to. So in some ways it's saying, well, it's a little more sophisticated or complicated than just saying less acculturated, middle acculturated, and more acculturated. But it's worth it because it really allows you to actually be relevant and focus on where the meaning is versus just making assumptions that because someone has been here for 10 years or less, they're going to want to be talked to in a certain way. This is just an example to show you how this there is not this mutual exclusivity, fundamentally in the ways that we had previously looked at acculturation. So 83% of U.S. Hispanics, regardless of acculturation level, identify with their country of origin. So if you say, where are you from? Someone might say, I'm from San Antonio, but soy mexicana, or soy cubano, or whatever the situation may be. And you also see that 60% of people are bilingual, and that is a characteristic of the Hispanic market. I think, again, probably those of us working in it are clearly aware of that a distinct thing here is that the loss of language is not it's not on par with previous immigrant populations in the U.S. You don't, after one generation, just lose the language. That the language and those cultural practices, even if you are completely acculturated, very well may stay as part of your life. So I think this just is an interesting kind of snapshot of that. So of those three circles that I was just talking about, the personal identity section, there's also then this community experience or community context. And just as we have talked about people experiencing acculturation levels, I think it's important to be able to evaluate markets in terms of acculturation level, particularly now as we see this dispersion of the population, and different markets have such amazingly different characteristics. So when you look at a market acculturation, we could say, like, identify with country of origin versus U.S. A good example of that for me is, let's say, Miami versus someplace like El Paso. Both places have very high proportion of the population Hispanic. Miami has the largest proportion of more Hispanics in the U.S., and a lot of those people are obviously Cuban, South American, Central American. And Miami really feels like, how many people have been to Miami? Miami! But Miami really feels like a place where people almost speak to you first in Spanish. Most places people wouldn't assume that I was Latina, but in Miami people would just assume that I was Cuban and just come talking to me, right? So it has a feel of, and people I really identify with being Latin American in Miami. If you go to El Paso, even though El Paso is just across the border, it's 90% Hispanic. That has been a place of, well, so many generations Hispanic, and part of the U.S., that people say, well, I'm American in the U.S. And so that is a acculturated market versus Miami, which is very unacculturated, but that creates very different experiences. The community language dynamic, I already mentioned that, but it's if you go back on how I mentioned before about, the sense of feeling comfortable or not comfortable about speaking Spanish in public, there may very well be some markets where people are not comfortable speaking Spanish in public, where it makes them feel like they stand out, where there's a tension there. And then there are markets, as I mentioned, like Miami or parts of LA, where you just speak Spanish naturally to anyone on the street, even if someone will say, oh, I don't speak Spanish, and they're the anomaly. But it's important to understand those characteristics when you're thinking about
marketing in language or not marketing in language, and the experience, how that will be received by the people that you're talking to. Obviously, there's cultural tension is important. I kind of created a separate section for that because I think it's something that we don't pay attention to enough, and it can be, cultural tension can actually be something if you think about it in the sensitive and realistic way and respond to it, it's something that can be very, you're really adding value to someone's life by addressing it. One of the things we had talked to, we've talked to our HP client about is that think about how important the role of a computer or a laptop is to someone who's living in a small town where there's not a lot of cultural resources, there's not a lot of language or media resources, and that computer is your connection to being able to not just stay in touch with people, but really feel comfortable with your culture and also empower you to deal with living in a place where there's not a lot of resources for you. So understanding that, where you can position, what does this mean? Or, I've worked for years with Nestle. So it was so emotional when we would go into stores and bring some of these Latin brands like La Lechera or Chocolate Abuelita, bring them to grocery stores where there were no Latino products, and all of a sudden people would say, wow, this makes me feel like this one little step, and all of a sudden I feel much more comfortable here. And so the emotional impact of that, the way we handled the launch from a marketing perspective, what we expected from the campaign and the program, was very different than if we just said, we're going to do an end cap and a big display at a very popular Hispanic grocery store in LA. And then obviously right now, this is particularly important for us to pay attention to, but at any point in time it's important is to look at the overall market lifestyle drivers. So home ownership, household composition, urban versus rural, the socioeconomic conditions, and the economic climate. And the distinction between those two things that I think is important is that you can look at the socioeconomic conditions, which are kind of broader conditions. I mean, right now we're in this a crisis. I think everybody is concerned. There's issues with all of them, blah, blah, blah. We don't have to go into it right now. We've probably all been reading about it. But I also think the economic climate is important to pay attention to. So, for example, I've done quite a bit of work, research in the Rio Grande Valley. That's a place where the economic climate doesn't feel, it's not a place where there feels like tons of potential. So the kids living there have kind of feeling like, well, if I'm going to do something else, I'm going to have to leave. And the parents living there kind of feel like, well, this is as good as I'm going to get being here, versus someplace like Austin or before all this stuff happened in Phoenix, where there was a sense of there's growth, there's opportunity. It's been more of an entrepreneurial environment or climate. So that, again, really changes the way people are going to hear messages and what's going to drive their behavior. And then leisure activities as well. If you're talking about someone who's living in New York versus someone in San Antonio, to really think about what is their lifestyle like. And that has a big impact on us when we think about choosing our shot lists for DM and the kinds of talent that we use and the kinds of insights that we bring to life may be very appropriate for some places and others not. So both profiling the people that you're talking to from a Hispanic standpoint, but also really understanding that context. I feel like we don't necessarily do as much of that as we should, and it adds a level of richness and efficacy that's very powerful. And then finally, so sort of the question is, all right, there's all this, I'm talking about all this stuff going on, I'm talking about ways of categorizing markets, getting more focused about how you might target regionally. But overall, if I'm saying let's evolve or be more sophisticated than this basic acculturation methodology, where do we go from here? And these are all things that we're probably all familiar with as direct marketers, behavioral, attitudinal, life stage, and lifestyle. But I think that in our industry, these have been much less applied to Hispanic marketing than they have in the general market, because it's almost like we have, as an industry, said, well, we don't need this kind of behavior, this kind of segmentation. We will rely on acculturation, and that's what drives it. We're starting to really push hard to bring this level of focus and this kind of variety of options to our clients and to our agency when we think about the best way to target for Hispanic. Obviously, from a behavioral standpoint, this is going to work best if you actually have a lot of proprietary data. And I think that, for that's always been that is a challenge for Hispanic. It's a challenge for any segment. We have this challenge at AT&T with Hispanic, with African American as well. So you say, well, how do I go about identifying my Hispanic customers? How do I go about tracking them and following their progress and understanding all of the different points of data capture that I could be engaged with? So that's something to think about, and it's something to ask yourselves, what can I do? What am I currently doing? What do I do with the general market? And are there creative and interesting things I can do where I can really start to identify Hispanics, not only based on language, because I think that's one of the challenges. So they'll say, okay, these people have identified themselves as wanting to do business in Spanish, so that's our Hispanic customer. And I think you guys will see clearly that based on what I was talking about earlier, that's leaving a big chunk of people on the table and of really interesting customers that like to be talked to in culture, but not necessarily prefer to be spoken to in Spanish. Attitudinal, this is also just as kind of and this is my personal belief, but you guys can have different opinions, but I feel like using attitudinal segmentation that is developed for the general market and just applying that to the Hispanic market is 9 times out of 10 a mistake. So because there are indicators and variables that are used to predict behavior or preference that you can see in general market models that don't necessarily apply to Hispanics. So, one of the things that when we're thinking about household composition is you could say, well, if I'm just looking at this one person and I look at their income and I look at their socioeconomic level, that person is not, or what that one individual person does, they don't have a propensity or the kind of right attitude to get engaged in my category or to be a heavy user or really excited about technology. But if you look at these multi-generational, very diverse households that you often see in the Hispanic market, then you realize, okay, that's too linear, that's limiting, and I need to develop an attitudinal model that is proprietary to my market and my category. So that's what I would always recommend. That's what we're trying to do with our clients when we do have clients that say, in a broad category, like financial services or technology, that's when we've found that attitudinal models work better because the behavior of those categories can look very similar. Most people have a cell phone, most people have DSL, and most people have TV in their house. And there's only so many different ways you can use that. But there are very diverse attitudes that drive behavior and preference. And that's where we're finding really interesting things happening when we start to apply those kinds of proprietary models to the Hispanic market. There's been some really interesting stories of great success looking at life stage segmentation. And Pampers is a great success story in the Hispanic market. Years ago, they started a user or customer kind of blog site where moms can share. It's called todobebe.com. If you ever wanted to look at it, it's really interesting. And I think they started it like 8 years ago, and it's become this great resource of women and moms talking to each other. But obviously, it's a great way to have that intersection of cultural preference and the life stage moment. That's very powerful. There's also, does your brand work in catalyst moments? So this is kind of a way to identify what kind of brand am I dealing with, what kind of relevance is there. And for example, Office Max isn't a catalyst, a life stage brand in total, but it is a catalyst moment that I'm going to stock my own office. And so understanding what the cultural nuances there, you heard me mention about the Latino women are the fastest growing group of small business owners. So it's interesting, let's think about that. Are there opportunities for us to identify opportunities there of cultural and life stage relevance? And then lifestyle, and I think this is also something that sometimes gets a little shortchanged on Hispanic because we do feel like maybe that acculturation supersedes this, but to really pay attention to what your brand might mean to the lifestyle and to the cultural relevance of your potential Hispanic customer. And you may not have a lifestyle brand, and if you don't have a lifestyle brand, then don't try to force it. But you may have a lifestyle brand that is not a lifestyle brand for the general market, but is a lifestyle brand for the Hispanic market. One of the stories kind of an interesting research story that I told is that I used to work with Reynolds Wrap, and I did a bunch of ethnographies about aluminum foil. I thought, well, this is not going to be the most exciting project in the world, right? Because we're dealing with aluminum foil, right? But we found that, wow, and for the general market, I think it is a functional brand. It's useful. You always have it in your cabinet, but whatever. It's not something where you're like, oh man, Reynolds Wrap, I'll tell you what, it means a lot to me. You can find a segment of Hispanic customers where It is extremely emotional. It is this thing that allows you to be creative and innovative and powerful, and you use it for all different kinds of things. And you can fix furniture, you can cover windows, you can curl your hair, you can cover your stove, you can anything you can think of, you can do with it. And that brand is associated with that lifestyle. You would never use a generic brand or anything else. It has to be Reynolds, and so something that's completely functional on the general market is this lifestyle definer on the Hispanic side. So I think that's also an interesting exercise, is to question yourself and to put your brand in the context of the true life context of the Hispanic consumer. So after going through all this stuff, and then we're going to look at the specific AT&T examples, but as I mentioned earlier, I know this is kind of, sounds a little trite, the first point, but I think it's really important to always try to remember, that we are talking about people, and that's why I think that having that sense of community context and that cultural context is so important. And really to try and remember, does it matter? Ask ourselves that. Will this matter? And we have that challenge all the time. We get stuck thinking so much about technical features or what our strategy for this quarter is, and we might be pushing something or talking about something in a way that really doesn't matter, and then that's when you realize, oh, this is not working, and that's fundamentally why it's not working. And while we're talking about all these new ways of assessing this market and all these different elements that may seem complicated, there are tools and models that we can use to assess how to talk to people, who we need to be talking to, categorize and understand markets and regions. But in the end, we can kind of compress that down, pull that down into something that should feel elegant and simple. It should, when it makes sense, when it matters, when we have the right conversation with the right people, it should feel simple. And I think that's also something we check ourselves with too, which is, if this feels convoluted and complicated and crazy and takes maybe 15 or 20 or 30 minutes to describe the brief to the creatives, then we're not on the right track. And also, this also sounds trite too, but I think especially when we get into direct marketing, sometimes it's that combination of tools and practices, but also our instincts as marketers of understanding, again, does this feel right? Does this make sense? Are we connecting with in a human way? And if not, then our tools aren't doing a good job and we should question them. So with that, let's get our strategy to work.
Hi. So I know that's a lot of information to digest, and thank goodness we have Elizabeth. How do we take this and focus this to the technology products that we have, and how are we going to sort of see this just evolve across our product set, and eventually sell what it is that we need to do, or whatever your goal is. And I think that that's really what it is. It's taking each individual element, and what all of that really says is it's a very simple thing. You've got just common sense marketing or common sense advertising. Know your consumer, what level they're at, and where you want to take them to drive what they want to do. And I've often said, to people, advertising should be very targeted to you based on the fact that it's not obviously going out of its way to target you. It just does, and you relate to it. Before you know it, you're sucked in like every advertiser wants you to be. So anyway, we have on the baseline of that just kind of this transactional function, which moves into the logistical and social behavior. One of the things that you're going to see throughout the series of work, we're doing some TV commercials, which you will see noted between the general market and Hispanic, and then we're going to take you into some direct mail where you'll see the differences. But it's kind of this idea of this sort of collective living, and it's not that you're collective and then everyone lives in their own house. So, oh, by the way, Mom, I'm living next door, not next to you, but just how people choose to sort of interact differently within that time, and also kind of looking at what the technology benefits are to the customer and what relates to me and what is it that I'm using it for. Because within the segment or within any kind of diverse advertising, people are using the technology for different purposes. And again, based on the level of acculturation, like Elizabeth was saying, some people are in touch more, trying to stay in touch with their families, trying to stay in touch with their country's news, trying to stay in touch in the U.S. with their kids, and just whatever level you're at, you can sort of use the technology services to help you achieve those. Anyway, and so it's again focused more on people than the level of individual utility. So right now we're just going to take you to just a quick overview here. AT&T, your world delivered. It's our tagline, and it's one of those things where it nicely fits into what we're trying to do is sort of take that environment and bring it home to the person as the consumer. And throughout the next well as a distinct creative platform. So with this series of ads that we recently ran, and some of you all, depending on which region you live in, may have seen them, it targeted the Lopez family. And so I don't know if any of you all are familiar or watched the Olympics. I didn't sleep for about 2 weeks. Crazy, but kind of going through the product features and the athletic parallels, as well as this family dynamic and sort of that sense of Latino pride. And we were having this meeting, and we're going through who's going to produce what we're going to do, and there are a series of athletes. So we went from, there's Master Lincoln and Michael Phelps, and AT&T is a proud sponsor of the U.S. Olympic team. And the Lopez family became a natural fit. Well, then we heard that the general market thought the Lopez family was a natural fit. So as a Hispanic marketer, sometimes you're like, oh, okay, well, let's see how we can work it out. And given all these differences we just noted, how are we going to sort of fit this together? Well, as we scripted out the differences and what you're about to see, it turned out that it was so distinctly different that we were able to move forward and target our segment with the creative insights that we use, because it really does end up being sort of a different consumer. So the first spot that you're about to see targets our general market DSL products. And it is called Dojo. And this is, again, general market featuring the DSL. If not, we're just going to get up and do some taekwondo.
So, Diana, how fast is your new broadband from AT&T?
Get the speed you need from AT&T with AT&T high-speed internet for the everyday low price of just $19.95 a month. Order other select speeds to find out how to get $50 cash back with qualifying services. Plus, get a free modem after rebate when ordered online. With AT&T, you get the fastest internet for the price. And with the nation's largest Wi-Fi network, you get more high speed in more places.
About that fast.
Get AT&T high-speed internet for only $19.95 a month, not an introductory rate. Order other select speeds to find out how to get $50 cash back with qualifying services. Plus a free modem after rebate when ordered online.
So, Diana, how fast is your new broadband from AT&T?
The new AT&T, your world delivered.
And before I comment on that, I want to play the Hispanic targeted one, so that see if you guys can kind of come with your own insights, and then I will point out some key differences.
¿Viste a los hermanos López? Son del equipo olímpico de taekwondo de los Estados Unidos.
¿Y?
Yo también soy López. Soy como ellos.
No, no lo eres.
Nada puede detenerte con Internet de alta velocidad Basic de AT&T a solo $19.95 al mes. Baja videos a velocidades sorprendentes y practica tus movimientos a tu propio ritmo.
Él está junto a sus primos. Ellos también son López.
Y comparte tu pasión con email, chat y mucho más por solo $19.95 al mes.
Vamos, papi.
Llama hoy y recibe $50 de reembolso en velocidades selectas o duplica tu reembolso y recibe $100 al ordenar en línea.
Hola, mija.
La nueva AT&T. Ponemos tu mundo a tu alcance.
Did you all see the difference? It's very distinct. The first one focuses a lot on the sport of taekwondo and the speed, kind of communicating the product, and it's just, the aerial shots, just kind of how you would shoot the cinematography are very different. And the other one's a little bit more intimate. It focuses on the family interacting, a little bit of that quirky humor, just very relational. And so they were different enough that we were able to do two ads. One of the things that we've also found at AT&T to work is not just taking, most of you all, or some of you all may already do this, but not just taking it TV, but taking it across all of the metric, or all of the mediums, and the direct mail, the radio spots, or online, so you have some kind of a holistic feeling and a holistic campaign. And a lot of times Spanish budgets are a lot smaller, or we'd like to say continuously growing, but you want to make sure that you sort of use your dollars most effectively, and that's something else that we've sort of found helps do it. So the next set's going to be coming up. It's actually featuring the Lopez family again and our other set of products. So just two more examples. Again, I'll let the both play in conjunction. And the first one's a general market spot, and it is entitled Supercharged.
The Lopez family stays connected to Team USA, the Olympic Games, and each other with AT&T. AT&T gives you all kinds of ways to connect. Call today to get home phone with unlimited long distance and the fastest internet for the price. Plus your choice of advanced TV with more HD channels than cable, or wireless with the best global coverage. 3 great services for under $99 a month. Not an introductory rate. Get up to $150 cash back. So choose the AT&T bundle that's right for you at an everyday low price. Get home phone with unlimited long distance and high-speed internet, plus your choice of advanced TV or wireless for under $99 a month. And for a limited time, get up to $150 cash back.
Hey, Steven! Phone!
Get connected to the Olympic Games and your world with AT&T today.
Hello? Hey, what's up?
The new AT&T, your world delivered.
This one is entitled Jobs. This next one.
Hey, Diana.
¿A qué hora vemos la película?
Como a las 8. No, 8:30. Ok, 8:30. Ah, 8:30.
Sí, los López hacen muchas cosas igual. Hasta usan los mismos servicios de AT&T. Llamadas locales, larga distancia, internet de alta velocidad y advanced TV o servicio móvil por menos de $99 al mes.
Papá, la película.
Recibe hasta $150 de reembolso con otros servicios que califiquen. O duplica tu reembolso y recibe hasta $300 al ordenar en línea.
Que empiece la película.
Ofrece llamadas locales, larga distancia, internet de alta velocidad y advanced TV o servicio móvil por menos de $99 al mes.
¿Listos?
La nueva AT&T. Ponemos tu mundo a tu alcance.
And jumping is apparently what they do to kind of warm up or get ready before these shots. So again, the first one, if you've seen The Matrix, it has a lot of that kind of movement and people just slow motion. And it's sort of about the featuring of each individual product as well as the distinct sort of sport-like behavior of the family. I think it's a very sharp, crisp image of what the athletes do. And the other one is focused quite a bit more on the family and the interaction and just sort of the natural usage of what a consumer may be doing with the product. And then also bringing the parents at the end, which just showed a nice little twist that obviously, the family of 4 are involved, the whole family's involved, and so that's really what drives a lot of their success, and focusing on that portion of it as well. So anyway, those are our 2 commercials that we featured. We're going to take you now to direct mail and just finish up with one example of that, and it's for our TV product or TV service, Uber. So right now we're going to show you 2 distinct pieces again here, and the first one is, they're both launch pieces, and the first one is a Uber's piece targeted toward the general market, and as you see here, it's just kind of the idea of sort of introduction. Here's a TV service. It does have a multicultural feel to it. Obviously, the product is displayed into it, but we thought we'd just sort of test a little something different, targeted to the segment, so this is going to take you here. One of the new hip things coming, a lot of it's driven out of Mexico City and some of the regions of Mexico, is graffiti art. And so doing it in the corporate, sort of not, it's just got a lot of that vibrant color and style that sort of adds a little bit of pop behind the pieces. Obviously having a strong translation that makes sense for the audience. We actually had something else, but we had to switch it out because it wasn't applicable to Southeast. So once again, another tip is making sure a lot of your translations are regionalized. Those of you who work with it, know that different words with Spanish, different words that are used in different regions may or may not be used in other parts. And I've learned some of those. I do speak Spanish. I've learned some of those the hard way. And they're like, what, staring at you, and you're like, oh no, I promise you, And so, I know. So just making sure that you're relevant. Anyway, the other thing that you notice here, which is just very subtle, but you've got the 2 people watching the TV together, and so it's not a forced view. It's not let's just make sure we focus on the family or whatnot. It's a very natural twist to that is how in our research we've known to see Hispanics watching TV, which is very collective and social behavior. So again, it's making it natural and not obvious, which is really just for the constant advertising. So to the last slide, I'm going to turn it over to Brenda to do some thought starters for things that you all may want to do when you're creating your own campaigns, and just kind of tips for how to move your programs forward.
Yeah, and this is just sort of, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. This is just sort of what we thought would be a takeaway for you when you go back and you start looking at your own Hispanic efforts or how you're getting into the multicultural space. Some of the things to ask yourself or to really explore. Know where you stand now. And this is really about what kind of targeting are you currently employing, and looking at not only with your Hispanic efforts, but what are you doing in the general market? What is your methodology? How are you, creating segments? How are you looking at targeting and apply those same philosophies over to the Hispanic segment? Oftentimes, that's at least a way to get started. And characterize your brand. Think truly, like Elizabeth was talking about, what kind of a brand are you? And what may be a lifestyle brand to Hispanics may not be a lifestyle brand to the general market. But what are you really working with? Is it a functional brand? Is it a commodity? Is it a combination of things? And the last two are really more, do you want to talk to?
Oh, sure, yeah. I mean, I think this is kind of what my whole session was about listening to your consumer and understanding their world, but I think that, in making an investment and really spending time with the people that you're trying to connect with, and being innovative and collaborative between, if you're on the corporate marketing side, working with your agencies and saying, what are interesting methodologies that we can do that might have to do with working directly with current customers, or designing specific research, or just going into markets and really being aware and listening and designing programs that allow you to have true insight about your brand, your category, and then this consumer that will allow you to build a more relevant and interesting strategy. And that's the same thing with understanding their world, is paying attention to that context. I think that's extremely important as whether you're doing regional targeting or you're doing national targeting. It's really important to not just view this consumer as a Hispanic consumer, but to view them as a Hispanic consumer who is living this kind of life and having this kind of experience, dealing and facing these kinds of challenges and addressing these challenges in this way or this way. So it adds some levels of depth and distinction there that have helped us really focus our strategy. With AT&T is a good example that we really, since we've been investing in this, we've been focusing our strategy and really getting to the heart about where we see this stuff mattering, and we are seeing a very strong improvement in what we're doing with this segment. So I think we wanted to open it up for questions if anyone wants.
Lots mechanisms that you offer, 800 number, reply card, website, and which of those did you think drew better, and do you think how that compares to a general one?
We offered an 800 number and a website for that piece. For AT&T, those pieces were actually mailed to current customers, and so it's an upgrade or a cross-sell program. But we do find, not just with AT&T, but with our other clients as well, that when it comes to a new product or something that there is a preference for calling and having a discussion about it. We are really right now working on figuring out how to use the online channel more effectively, because obviously this is a less expensive channel. There's actually interesting areas for engagement that could be very important, where you could demo products, you could have live chats, you could create customer-to-customer chatting or blogging to allow people to, that's the Pampers site. They do a great job with that. But we still see the phone channel as this biggest skew as a response, and more than reply cards or anything else. Over here, kind of at the end, but it's about, I want to understand, I want to talk, I want to feel like I can connect with someone, and then a transaction.
I think we found by explaining more about what we're trying to achieve, you can lessen that substantially, and actually, make the customer feel more comfortable by explaining more on the upfront.
Ongoing relationship that adds value. So if you're a customer and you feel like I don't have the kind of access that I want as a fan customer, I don't have the kind of ongoing feeling that I'm valuable, then they'll seek that out someplace else. So it's important. It's not just about the initiation of the relationship. It's about an ongoing process of keeping that feeling of like, okay, we have a connection. And if that's not there, then we do see frequent switching or a sense of, if there's not good customer service, I mean, that's really one of the biggest issues. If there's not good customer service, that's a very, very serious issue. And
the
if there's
language going throughout the entire process is always very important too. If the customers initiated that contact, you want to make sure you stay with them, not just sell them, and then you just sort of cut them off once you actually get them on board. So,
But there's a sense of taking the promise that this company or brand is making to me at the initiation of the relationship seriously and expecting that to play out consistently through the programs and through the other touches.